Hello and welcome to the movie review of the 2000 thriller Castaway, starring the very likable guy Tom Hanks. Castaway is a really good movie. It's simultaneously scary and a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed watching it. There's a heavy element of Robinson Crusoe, or the archetype of the modern man thrown into the wilderness and stranded, and forced to survive on his creativity and ingenuity. This is a concept I've always found particularly thrilling. There's something that's just so primal about it, about taking the domesticated, pampered, soft human and putting it back into the environmental arena, the elements, where survival is only granted to those who can successfully integrate themselves into the ecology of whatever brutal habitat they happen to be in. Alright, so let's get into it. Castaway begins with Chuck Noland, a FedEx systems engineer played by Tom Hanks, who's living his life in Memphis, Tennessee. He has a girlfriend, and it's pretty serious. They want to get married, but Chuck's job keeps him busy. Because he works for FedEx, he flies all over the world delivering packages internationally, and it often disrupts his personal life. The movie's opening scenes include a heartwarming Christmas with the family, but it's interrupted when Chuck is summoned to fly to Malaysia to resolve some kind of trade or shipping dispute. So he's got a pretty normal life. He's a normal guy. And the audience can connect with him, especially with Christmas scenes like this. So with Christmas dinner interrupted, he hops on a FedEx cargo plane going overseas, and he heads to Malaysia. Before he leaves, his girlfriend gives him a special gold pocket watch with her picture in it. And then, before he knows it, he's off and flying, high over the Pacific Ocean, on the way to Malaysia. The flight goes pretty smoothly at first, but when he approaches the cabin to chat with the pilots, he sees that they're intensely focused on navigating and flying the plane. Outside the cockpit window, there are black storm clouds. Chuck and the viewer are unsettled by the behavior of the pilots. Things are not going smoothly. They apparently don't know where they are, or they've lost contact with radio towers. This is the chilling beginning to a truly harrowing scene. The storm gets worse, and the turbulence gets stronger. Chuck goes to take a piss in the plane's lavatory, but he's suddenly sucked out when the cabin loses pressure. It seems as if a giant hole has broken somewhere in the hull, as there's gray rainwater blasting into the cabin, accompanied by the sound of roaring wind and the blaring alarms of the plane's emergency response systems. A strong bump of turbulence throws one of the crewmen into the ceiling, where he splits his head open. He crawls around on the ground, shaking and trying to hold closed his head wound, which is spurting blood, before eventually he gets crushed by a loose pallet of cargo. Chuck looks out the cockpit window to see storm clouds. The clouds suddenly part, revealing their shockingly low altitude and their fatal orientation. The plane is pointing straight down, and it's careening towards the ocean. Somehow, they manage to level out before the impact, but the cabin is flooded, and the rest of the crew are killed more or less instantly. Chuck somehow manages to survive the impact, and clings to an inflatable raft as he floats away from the wreckage, carried by black storm waves. When there's no flash of lightning, the sky and the sea are pitch dark. This entire crash scene is terrifying, especially if you've been in a plane that's hit heavy turbulence. I have, and even though I, in the abstract, understand that commercial airplanes are built to withstand turbulence, their wings are supposed to design and flex in response to turbulence. Even knowing that, it's still not fun experiencing it. And seeing such an intense crash scene in the movie was as exciting as it is bone-chilling. I want to mention also the earlier scene, before the crash, where Chuck is casually walking up to the pilots and trying to have casual conversation. Now, I know that this was a private cargo flight, so the rules with the passengers would have probably been a little less strict than on regular commercial flights, but it was still strange, seeing this casual approach between pilot and passenger. In the post-9/11 world, this is a thing that's unheard of. The cockpit doors are locked for most of the flight, and passengers aren't allowed close to it. They don't even let lines form at the bathrooms near the cockpit anymore. And this isn't a fault of the movie, because Castaway was made the year before 2001, but it is interesting in a strange way how we look back at these seemingly benign and totally ordinary behaviors and suddenly see them in a whole new light. Anyway, back to the film. Chuck has crashed, and he's been thrown into the sea. By chance, his raft washes up on the beach of an uninhabited island, somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. When he comes to the next morning, Chuck begins exploring his new island home and collecting washed-up FedEx packages. After a few days, he finds the body of a crew member washed up on the beach. He takes the guy's flashlight and buries him. As Chuck continues to explore the island, he begins to gather coconuts to eat. We see him slurping rainwater from leaves, which would be a meager but critical serving of fresh water to keep him alive. He cracks open coconuts for their milk and flesh, and this part is kind of neat, because he begins by throwing the coconuts against a rocky wall, like a large rock wall, but that doesn't work, so he kneels down and begins bashing the coconut against a smaller rock, which is more energy efficient and it works better. Now, I really liked this scene, because its desperation and inventiveness reminded me of the experimenting primate. Chuck is quite literally an intelligent ape, learning how to manipulate his environment to his advantage. So this is like a first step towards integrating into his new habitat. And I was just amused that the scene, it had such a fundamental similarity to watching a monkey or another ape bash a coconut or a big heavy seed against a rock in an attempt to crack it open. He also tries to harpoon some fish, but he's awkward and clumsy. Although, as you would expect, he gets better with this as time goes on, and he gets more practice. One night, Chuck sees a ship on the horizon, and he tries to get their attention with his flashlight, but it doesn't work. His flashlight is just too weak, and they don't notice him. He tries to get into his raft to swim out to them, but he's beaten back by the waves, and the raft is popped by the shallow coral. And to make matters worse, his leg gets impaled on the coral, and he gets a big, deep, rugged flesh wound. Defeated by the wilderness and denied rescue, he limps back up the beach. And to add insult to injury, his flashlight is on when he falls asleep, and the battery dies. The next day, realizing there's no point in trying to deliver the packages because he's probably doomed to this island, Chuck opens them to see if there were any useful things. He finds VHS tapes, birthday cards, divorce papers, ice skates, a dress, and, most curiously, a Wilson volleyball that he names Wilson. He doesn't open one package, a rectangular box with blue wrapping paper and a sticker of angel's wings on it. These wings, these angel wings, will be a running motif throughout the rest of the movie. While woodworking, Chuck cuts his hand, and in his anger he kicks stuff around and throws the volleyball. His bloody handprint splattered on the volleyball looks kind of like a head with spiky hair, and he rubs away some blood to make a face out of it. This volleyball, now familiarized with a human-like face, becomes Wilson, a silent character that Chuck interacts with. Like, he really has full-on conversations with Wilson, as this is the only form of socialization that he has, because otherwise he's just alone on the island. There's even a scene where Chuck gets desperate and mad that he's going to die on the island, wasting his life talking to a volleyball. In anger, he throws Wilson away into the wilderness, but almost immediately regrets it, running after Wilson, screaming his name, and then crying when he can't find him. Although he quickly spots Wilson floating against a rock, and is genuinely relieved to have his only friend back. It's a really interesting look at the social needs of the human mind. Loneliness is immensely uncomfortable for us. We require social interaction, otherwise we kind of start going crazy. And so, in the most desperate of situations, when stranded all alone, we'll create human figures out of inanimate objects, things that we can personify, so as to keep us company, and to keep us sane. There are many scenes where he's working in a cave, breaking coconuts or making rope or fire, all while talking to Wilson. There's another great scene where Chuck uses friction and some kindling to make a fire. He had tried before with no success, and once actually hurt himself with a huge splinter, but finally he gets it. It's a really great achievement, and it harkens back to the earliest humans, whose first major invention beyond sharpened rocks and sticks would have been the ability to create and capture fire. Later that night, we see Chuck dancing and celebrating around a campfire. He stands there in the primeval glow of the flame, his shirt off like an atavistic hominid, and he beats his chest and screams, "I have made fire! I have made fire!" It's pretty awesome. And it's another one of those scenes that really captures something fundamental about the human element. The ingenious human working against the wilderness to keep himself comfortable and alive. And the most basic symbol of this is the campfire. Now that he has fire, he's able to cook the meat that he hunts, like fish and crab. And this would greatly reduce his risk of catching pathogens or parasites embedded in the seafood. Speaking of illnesses, Chuck is also shown to have an abscess in his gum, above a tooth on his upper jaw. The tooth had been giving him pain the whole movie, but now it had progressed into an infection. There's a painful scene where he lines up the blade of a skate against his infected tooth, and then hits the other side of the skate with a rock. He punches out his infected tooth, and passes out from the pain. This runs the risk of further infection, but it gets rid of the abscess and he survives. At one point, in his loneliness and desperation, he tries to commit suicide. He fashioned a rope out of coconut husk fiber and made a noose, and tried to hang himself off of a tree growing out of the side of a cliff. Only the tree breaks and he survives. He would later go up to gather that rope to use it in a raft. At the end of the movie, when he's recollecting his experiences, he talks about being unable to kill himself the way he wanted to, and that made him feel so powerless, with control over nothing, not even the way he wanted to die. And yet, this gives him a warm feeling of determination, where he chooses to live. One day, a section of wall from a portable toilet washes up on shore, which he realizes can be used as a sail for his raft. He paints the angel wings on the walls, or the new sail, almost like it's his logo or his coat of arms. So Chuck makes a super primitive raft, one that can hardly be called seaworthy, and he sets off. He ties Wilson to the raft for company, and he raises the sail or the toilet wall so that he can catch some wind and overcome the waves pushing him back to the shore. Having escaped the island, he now finds himself lost at sea. The ocean is calm for some time until a new storm hits, which almost destroys his raft. The sail is ripped off, and the raft is badly damaged. That night, a whale comes and looks at him, studying the curiosity that is this lost, doomed primate, clearly out of his element, clinging to life in the most hopeless of situations. The next day, Wilson breaks off the raft and floats out to sea. Chuck tries to swim after him, but Wilson is too far gone. The poor man returns to the raft and weeps over his lost friend. It's interesting to note that he cries more for the volleyball than he did for the dead pilot, although, to be fair, he'd only known the pilot for the duration of his doomed flight, and he lived with Wilson on the island for 4 years. While Chuck is stranded at sea, the whale returns, blowing water on him to try to wake him up at critical moments. The whale tries to alert him to Wilson floating away, and later the whale successfully wakes him up in time to get noticed by a passing cargo ship. So finally, after 4 years, Chuck is rescued. In one scene, he's tan and hairy, unshaven, reaching up from his primitive raft with the last of his energy, gesturing at the crewmen aboard the cargo ship. And in the very next scene, he's clean-shaven, wearing a suit, on board a plane flying back home. It's a shocking contrast, which highlights the almost absurd differences between the man suffering against the forces of nature and the man that's been returned to domestic civilization, on board an aircraft, with carpeting, air conditioning, and reclining seats. Chuck returns home to an awkward party thrown by FedEx in celebration for his survival. It's bittersweet and almost uncomfortable, because the realities of modern life hit him really hard. There's a scene where he looks at the buffet they've prepared, with giant crab's legs, bigger than any crab he ever caught on the island. There's a lighter for candles, which provides flame at the flick of a button. There are light switches that give him perfect light, even in the darkest hours of the night. All of these modern conveniences are uninteresting and blandly casual to us, but to him, they're now seen from a whole new perspective, It's almost like he can't believe it. The hardest part of coming home, though, was finding out that everyone thought he was dead. They had a funeral for him. His girlfriend had moved on and married someone else and even had a daughter with him. They have a painful, awkward reunion where Chuck returns the pocket watch. She shows him all the info they had on the plane crash and the rescue operation, including a map, and Chuck learns that he was found on his raft 500 miles from the island he washed up on. The movie island was about 600 miles south of the Cook Islands. In real life, there's no islands here, but in all of that time that Chuck was lost, he was never found despite search parties going on for weeks. They were just searching in the wrong area. Before he finally leaves, he has one last moment with his former girlfriend, where she kisses him and they tell each other they still love each other. It's a tender moment for a relationship that was torn apart by fate, and now, because of circumstance, it is unable to take up where it left off. The final scenes in the movie come back to the package with the angel wing sticker on it. Now, Chuck never opened this package, but he did hang on to it. He even carried it with him on his raft, and he eventually returns it to the sender. But when he goes to their house, no one is home. When he drives away, he's at a deserted intersection, and a nice lady in a truck stops to ask him if he needs a ride. He declines, and when she drives away, he looks and sees the same angel wing sticker on her rear window. Alright, so I really liked this movie, but I definitely don't consider it perfect. It's not like a really wonderful movie. For its plot, I'll give it an 8 out of 10, which is a really strong score. I mean, the plot is solid. It's simple, but it makes sense. It's good, it's realistic, and it's captivating. The reason that I didn't rate it perfectly is because I don't think they used the 4-year time skip very well. The time skip was, I don't want to say clumsy, because there was a nice transition scene between him struggling to fish when he first got there, and then after 4 years, when he's all tan and hairy, he's able to hunt really well. That was a cool transitionary scene, but I just feel like it happened a little early. I would have really liked it if the movie explored more of his life on the island, like what he did day to day, what he did at night, any of his creative pursuits, any other constructs like shelter or tools that he made. These are all really interesting things that the movie could have explored in greater detail, but they didn't. They just kind of covered over it all with a 4-year time skip. And I mean, it works in the movie, I guess. I just would have liked a little bit more. I mean, I felt like we got a good look into his rugged primal lifestyle. We just didn't get a great look into it. I would have enjoyed more content here, but it's a small complaint for an otherwise really good film. Now, as for Castaway's depiction of biology, I'm kind of struggling to come up with a good score. I mean, I liked all the scenes that showed how he survived on the island, and I wish there was more, but only some of what I saw was legit. I mean, the way he made fire, the way he gathered fresh water from leaves and from coconuts, and the way he learned to hunt fish, and the parts about human psychology, and especially the existential loneliness in the face of an indifferent and brutal cosmos with no compatriot that can talk back to you with just a volleyball. I mean, that was all really cool and explored really well in the movie. But there were some scenes that either were or they had implications that were more than a bit unrealistic. In one scene, for example, he eats uncooked fish and crab, which is highly likely to give him a horrible parasitic infection. When he gets his leg gashed up by the coral, that wound would have almost certainly become infected, and without any medicine, without any antibiotics, that probably would have killed him. He also would have suffered immensely if his tooth infection got worse after knocking it out with a dirty blade of a skate. Without medicine, or even bandages, his risk of getting one or more infections on this tropical South Pacific island, including symptoms that could cripple or kill him, that risk would be extremely high. Although, like with most Survivor movies, I guess avoiding the premature death of the main character is good reason to use at least a little bit of plot armor. Otherwise, it really wouldn't have been much of a movie, and it would have had a very different ending. So ultimately, I'll give Castaway a 7 out of 10 for its depiction of biology. It's a strong score, but it's not perfect. All in all, Castaway is a great film. If you haven't seen it, you definitely should. It's an iconic film, especially the character of Wilson, which has, in its own quiet, unspeaking way, become a part of popular culture. Lots of later movies in the stranded survivor genre include a subtle nod to Wilson. So there you have it. Castaway is a disaster flick, a survival film, and a character study all in one.